Thanks very much. Thanks for having me today. So, hello, and yeah, thanks again for coming. It's wonderful to see everyone. So, as Andrew introduced me, I'm Gabriel Elvery, and I'm a second year PhD student studying fantasy and affect in video games. Please do feel free to tweet about the talk and share pictures of the slides and tag me. Getting feedback is really fun and wonderful. So my talk is a bit different because it's actually not about my research, but it's about the processes I use to make my research possible. So it's about all the work that people don't see, the work that I put into maintaining my mental health. This is something I've been exploring on my blog, which is hybrid creative nonfiction that weaves together aspects of my research with my personal narrative. I see the personal and professional as interconnected, and I think it's really important, especially in academia, that we destigmatize talking about emotion, struggle, and mental health and consider ways of balancing the two. Just a brief note on the content warnings. There'll be mentions of death and sexual assault, which I'll verbally flag when you're past them and give you a visual cue on my slides. Mental illness, however, will be referenced throughout. So this talk straddles the professional and the personal in a way that we're perhaps unused to. Throughout our education, we're told to keep ourselves out of our research, to practice objectivity and keep it separate from who we are. But feminist scholarship and qualitative research practices stress that objectivity is a myth. We can't entirely keep the public and the personal divided. Even when we're doing our research, our experiences shape our choice of topics, how we interact with them, and why. Academia is no longer an ivory tower. Researchers aren't necessarily privileged people, nor is what we do isolated from the outside world. We come from a plethora of diverse backgrounds and situations and frequently have to deal with extremely challenging life things on top of doing extremely challenging research. Take me, for example. I've had a hell of a few years. So your first content warning. As I was writing my master's dissertation, I began to recall traumatic memories of a sexual assault that happened 10 years prior. Then on the week of my dissertation deadline, someone was killed in my apartment block. I worked 3 jobs whilst trying to get funding for my PhD, all whilst doing voluntary academic work to support my application. In November 2019, just after starting my first year as a researcher, I left my fiancé of 6 years and what some would describe as a toxic relationship. Then in July this year, my closest family member, my grandfather, died before I could visit him because of the pandemic. Throughout the years, I've suffered with the various symptoms of mental illness, including disassociation, memory loss, fatigue, and suicidal ideation, as well as an inability to read or enjoy media. I've been on 5 different antidepressants and traipsed through countless therapists' office. I've made and scrapped a million routines. I eat right, I sleep right, I work out when I can. I do what the doctor says are the right things, but it's not a cure. I've recently been diagnosed with BPD and PTSD, which explains why I have to work so hard to manage my mental health. The outlook for these conditions is better than ever, but I need at least 2 different types of therapy in a specific order, and it's not easily accessible on the NHS. For anyone who doesn't know, BPD stands for borderline personality disorder. One of the main symptoms is emotional dysregulation. People with BPD often have to work very hard to identify and regulate their moods and often use maladaptive, sometimes dangerous, coping mechanisms in order to function. This means that I've spent a lot of time, both pre and post diagnosis, learning how to manage my feelings and replace my bad coping mechanisms with good ones to function in a way which is safe and sustainable. My condition also means that I've had to face various challenges to the way that I learn because my brain has been impacted by mental illness, which sometimes impairs my cognitive function. The reason I'm so open about my diagnosis is the same reason that I'm so afraid of being open about it. There is so much stigma surrounding BPD and it's incredibly misunderstood. I want to do my part to lift some of that stigma and have also written a blog about my diagnosis, which is on my website. If you're waiting for the content warning to be finished, you can listen again. I often worry about my frequently poor mental health, and sometimes I question my place in academia. How can I do something so cognitively taxing or claim to do high quality research when I can't always trust my mental faculties to work in a neurotypical way? How can I keep up when everyone else looks like they're doing so well? I often thought I was the only one struggling, but none of this is uncommon, and these are all thoughts gathered from other academics on social media, words which are often left unspoken. With the rise in mental health awareness, the discourse surrounding it often gives us trite advice. Make sure you take time off, go for a walk, play a game, eat some nice food. We've heard it all before, and it's easier said than done. When you're doing all of the good things so that you can feel well enough to work, it can feel like another way that research is dominating your life. What helped me was when I realised I could use my research to make my life better too. I've been trying to be kind to myself to improve my work, but could my work actually help me be kinder to myself and kinder to others? Caretaking isn't valued nor recognised for the skill it is. Some of our worst paid professions are the caring ones. Crafting human happiness is just not productive. You can't quantify a smile. Kindness is viewed as something that people just are and do, rather than something which should be learned and practiced. I started looking back at my experiences in education to help me develop my theory of kindness as praxis, which conceptualizes the skill of caretaking with something that isn't innate but must be practiced and developed. It's about taking the best parts of your research and the skills you've developed throughout your time in work in academia and applying them to your life to help us get our research done, but also to both take care of ourselves and others in a personal and professional capacity. This can be done by anyone. Only you know how to best apply the skills you've gathered from your field. If you're in education, you might consider if the way you look after your pupils can provide insight into the way you look after yourself. If you're in computing science, you might consider how to apply the logical ways that you work through coding problems to problems in your personal life. It might even be something as universal as looking at the graduate attributes and thinking about how we can use these skills in our personal rather than professional lives. I use the graduate attributes, which are the soft skills we develop whilst doing academic work in any field, to create an outline of what kindness as praxis might look like. The structure has much in common with the stages of carrying out a project. During step 1, we must act as subject specialists in relation to ourselves and use our critical thinking to identify areas we might struggle with. We can stop and think about our lives and work and consider whether there are patterns emerging which contribute to our stress. We may also wish to consult other subject specialists, such as trusted friends and family who are experts in you, or professionals who can give you an insight into an area you want to focus on. We can then do our research on this area, read widely, listen to podcasts, think about your own research and see if you can take any inspiration from your subject area. Step 3 requires our study and presentation skills. We can create resources for ourselves, notes, posters, anything that will help us remember the healthy habits we're trying to maintain. We might make plans and schedules even. It's important, though, as with any academic piece of work, that we revisit this first draft of our solution and edit it. This requires that we check in with ourselves and be reflective to critically assess whether what we are doing is working or not and how we can improve. The final step is less about the self and more about others. Although we are all from uniquely different situations and facing different sets of circumstances, perhaps understanding our own struggles can help us be more sensitive to others and communicate in a kinder way. This is very similar to carrying out peer review. You're far less likely to give overly harsh feedback if you've been on the receiving end of some yourself. Kindness as praxis will look different for everyone, but I wanted to share an example from my own life to demonstrate how I'm putting it into practice. The process I'm about to detail was a conscious choice, but I wasn't following the steps I'm showing you now. I was finding them out as I went along. It's only looking back at the last year and a half that I've been able to identify my process in a way that makes it more presentable. Step 1, it's much like finding a suitable topic for your research project, identifying your needs like you would spot a niche that needs to be filled in your research field and analyze the most viable way of meeting those needs. It's almost like pitching a project, but to yourself. Step 1 for me occurred after my breakup. I was still processing a lot of the traumatic things I've been remembering, and I realized that if I wanted to meet my goals as a researcher, that I needed to, and also as someone capable of living a long and a healthy life, I needed to find a way to cope. I was lucky to find a very supportive GP who confirmed my suspicions that I was suffering from emotional dysregulation. And by analysing my emotional state and behaviour in conversation with them, I was able to identify key areas that I wanted to focus on. As I started to change things about my life, I realized that aspects of my research overlapped with my personal difficulties. It turns out that I'm studying emotion in video games because I have to work extremely hard to understand emotions in general, and I find them quite fascinating. Where I got inspiration for both how to help myself and eventually the development of kindness as practice as a theory was a podcast called The Psychology of Video Games. In that podcast, Kelly Dunlap outlines a model of empathy which is used to inform game design. Dunlap divides empathy into two types: affective or emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. Dunlap describes cognitive empathy as the mental ability to project yourself into the experience of someone else and to understand what's going on and why they might be thinking or feeling what they're thinking or feeling. Put simply, cognitive empathy helps us to walk a mile in others' shoes and to see the world through their eyes. On the other hand, emotional empathy are the feels. If we see someone else experience strong emotion, we may feel these emotions mirrored in ourselves, and that gives us the motivation to care or to act because it's uncomfortable for us and we're trying to decrease our discomfort. Dunlap explains that empathy works optimally when the two aspects are integrated. She says, because if you're all emotional empathy and zero cognitive empathy, if you're all cognitive empathy rather and zero emotional empathy, you're basically Hannibal Lecter, where you understand what everyone is going through, but you don't care. And if you're all emotional empathy, you're a weeping mess and you have no idea why. That's a big mood. I realized that I've often shut down and repressed my emotional empathy because I feel things in a way which is overwhelming at times. I realized that I had to start using my cognitive empathy to be kind to myself and treat myself how I would treat a friend in distress. Once I'd identified the problem and gathered resources about it, I started to create things that would help me with the aid of my dialectical therapy workbook, which is something I use every day. With the aid of this book, I created a color-coded notebook full of different coping strategies, so lots and lots of fun admin. Then I took my most useful positive affirmations and stuck them all over my flat so that when I feel a strong emotion that feels overwhelming, I'm reminded that it will pass. It will not last forever. I really struggled this month because one of the strategies I used to control my mood was physical activity. I really enjoy running and lifting weights. However, I was unable to do so because I fell ill with COVID and developed long COVID. Not only couldn't I go outside, but I also have fatigue, headaches, muscle pain, and breathing difficulties, which are exacerbated by exercise. When I first fell unwell, I experienced a big mental health relapse and realized I had to make a big change. Instead of working out, I found other ways to regulate my mood and replace my fitness with less physically strenuous activities, such as playing video games, which is useful for work as well. So this step is perhaps the hardest. You can only really communicate about your research once you've got a good chunk of it done and you know what you're doing. And it also helps to talk to people and get feedback as well. I'm still very much in the process of figuring myself out with regard to my relationships, and the pandemic hasn't made things much easier. What I do know and what I hope is that having some insight into my own feelings can help me understand other people better and communicate more clearly and more kindly and think about things in a more considered way. So giving this talk is a positive step in that direction. I've taken everything I've learned and hopefully presented it in a way that will be useful to you. So that's my step-by-step process of kindness as praxis. But how can the mindset as a whole change the way that we interact with our sense of self? Well, it's my hope that considering the ways that our academic work benefits us as a whole person, not just as a researcher, that can actually help us keep our careers in perspective sometimes. Another symptom of my BPD is that I have an unstable sense of self, which means that I can forget who I am, what I value, and place too much of my worth in external sources of validation, such as my work. It's important to remember that although we may value our time working, it does not define us as a whole person. It's just one part of us, and perhaps a part that, if harnessed, can be used to improve who we are and the quality of our lives in general. Kindness as praxis is about developing coping strategies, sure, but it's also about being mindful, paying attention to yourself, and finding what works for you. Use your knowledge to help manage your emotions. Be kind with your head, even if you don't feel it in your heart. Use your skills to make someone smile, because that's the best kind of impact. Thank you.